Sometimes, it is not the loudest cries that demand our attention, it is the silent ones, buried deep within broken hearts. Welcome to Veil Marks, where every story is a journey through shadows and light. In this powerful video, we follow the incredible odyssey of a forgotten pitbull named Titan, whose silent suffering sparked a wave of redemption. As Helen Keller once said, although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it. Stay with us until the end, because within this story lies a lesson so profound that it may change how you see love, loyalty, and healing forever. Boulder County Animal Refuge had once been a place of hope, where wagging tails and second chances filled the hallways. But as the years wore on, and budget cuts deepened like cracks in an aging foundation, that hope grew harder to find. By late autumn, the refuge was teetering on the edge of collapse. Staff numbers had dwindled to a bare minimum, leaving exhausted volunteers scrambling to cover shifts. Kennels, once clean and welcoming, had begun to crumble, the paint peeling from the walls, the fencing rusted at the seams. The smell of too many animals and too few hands hung heavy in the air. It was in one of the darkest corners of this failing shelter that Chance was found. The Pitbull mix had arrived 3 nights earlier, brought in by a weary animal control officer who had picked him up wandering along a deserted highway. No collar, no microchip. No one came forward to claim him. He was just another forgotten dog, another soul left behind. Yet even among the dozens of animals crammed into the shelter, Chance was different. He did not bark or whine like the others. He did not pace his kennel restlessly or leap at the bars in desperate bids for attention. Instead, Chance lay curled tightly in the farthest corner, his body trembling so violently it was as if the very ground beneath him shook. His eyes, when they dared open, were dark and hollow, staring through everything and everyone, as if he no longer expected kindness or even survival. A hastily scribbled note on his intake sheet caught the eye of the few staff members still paying attention amidst the chaos. Handle with extreme care severe signs of abuse. No loud voices. No sudden movements. It was a warning and a plea. Chance had become, in the words of one longtime volunteer, the silent heartbeat of the refuge. No sound came from his kennel, but the faint whisper of his shivering breaths. To those who passed by, it seemed as though the very life had been drained from him, leaving behind only a shell of fur and bone. Few dared to linger near his kennel. In a place overwhelmed with animals demanding immediate needs, feeding, cleaning, medicating, there was little time for the slow, patient work that a dog like Chance required. His presence was a quiet rebuke to the growing despair that infected the shelter. He was a reminder that sometimes the damage could not be undone with a warm blanket and a handful of treats. Sometimes it ran deeper, into places no human eye could see. Outside, the Colorado winds battered the aging building, rattling the loose panels on the roof. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed overhead, casting harsh, unforgiving light down on Chance's trembling form. The world had not been kind to him, and here, even in supposed refuge, survival seemed less a promise than a fragile hope. Abby Collins first noticed him during one of her volunteer shifts, the youngest and newest face in a place increasingly filled with resignation. A 22-year-old veterinary student, Abby had a heart too big for her own good, or so her professors often warned. She had been drawn to the shelter not just by her love of animals, but by a stubborn belief that even in broken places, healing could happen. The moment she saw Chance, something shifted inside her. He did not bark. He did not whimper. He only pressed himself tighter into the corner, as if trying to make himself disappear. Abby crouched several feet from the kennel door, saying nothing, just watching. She could see it the way his ribs moved with every shallow breath, the way his eyes tracked every motion as if bracing for another blow. She read his intake notes and felt her stomach twist. Severe signs of abuse. Handle with care. There was something in his silence that spoke louder than any cry could have. In that moment, Abby made a quiet vow to herself. She would not let him be forgotten, not him. Elsewhere in the building, chaos reigned. Puppies barked incessantly. Kittens mewled for attention, and staff rushed from kennel to kennel, trying to do the work of 3 people each. No one noticed how Chance flinched, even at the sound of a mop bucket being dragged across the floor. No one, that is, except Abby. She began visiting his kennel every shift, even if all she could do was sit quietly nearby, reading textbooks aloud in a soft, steady voice. It was a technique she had learned during a course on animal trauma recovery, a way to help severely abused animals grow accustomed to a human presence, without pressure or fear. For now, Chance remained frozen in his corner, muscles locked tight with dread, but Abby understood something most others did not. Healing could not be rushed. It had to be offered again and again, without expectation. As night fell and the last of the volunteers trickled out, Chance lay alone in his kennel, his heartbeat, once frantic and rapid, now slowed to a fragile rhythm, somewhere deep inside that broken body. The smallest ember of hope stirred, not enough to move, not enough to trust, but enough perhaps to endure another day. No one knew it yet, but Chance's arrival marked the beginning of a story that would shake the very foundations of Boulder County Animal Refuge. His silent suffering would become the spark that forced an entire community to confront the ways it had failed the voiceless. And as the winds howled outside and the lights flickered once more, Chance, broken, silent, invisible, continued to breathe, waiting for something or someone who might finally see him. The second Tuesday of November began like any other at the Boulder County Animal Refuge, frantic, short-staffed, and weighed down by a sense of hopelessness that seemed to seep from the very walls. The bitter wind outside rattled the loose window frames, sending a cold draft skimming across the cracked tile floors. Inside, the overworked staff moved mechanically from task to task, their faces etched with fatigue. Among them was Calvin Ross, a newly hired caretaker barely 2 weeks into the job. Tall, broad-shouldered, and quick-tempered, Calvin had come recommended more for his willingness to work late shifts than for any particular compassion for animals. His training had been minimal, a rushed orientation overshadowed by the shelter's desperate need for manpower. This morning, like many before, Calvin was responsible for cleaning the kennels in the West Wing, where Chance lay trembling in his enclosure. Chance had not moved from his corner since the night before. He remained curled into himself, flinching at every sound, his ribs heaving with shallow, terrified breaths. His body language was clear. Terror had welded him to the concrete. He would not approach, would not eat in the presence of others, and certainly would not make eye contact. Calvin was behind schedule. His patience, already thin from a sleepless night and an overburdened shift, was wearing dangerously close to breaking. He rattled the latch on Chance's kennel, muttering curses under his breath. The pit bull's body stiffened at the noise, pressing even tighter against the cold wall. "Come on, you dumb mutt," Calvin snapped, stepping into the kennel with a bucket and mop. When Chance refused to move, frozen in place by paralyzing fear, Calvin's irritation flared into something uglier. He reached down sharply to grab the dog's collar. Chance tried to shrink back, trembling so violently his nails scratched faintly against the floor. That was when it happened. With a snarl of frustration, Calvin raised his hand and struck Chance across the side of his head hard. The sound echoed obscenely in the small kennel, a sickening thud followed by a sharp, high-pitched yelp. Chance collapsed fully to the floor, his legs giving out beneath him, his body folding into itself in pure terror. His breathing grew frantic, almost hyperventilating as he tried to disappear into the corner, to make himself so small he might vanish altogether. Calvin, breathing heavily, stood over him for a moment before glancing quickly at the security camera, bolted to the ceiling. Either he assumed no one was watching, or he simply did not care. Without another word, he finished his hurried cleaning, slopping dirty water across the already grimy floor, barely glancing at the shivering form huddled against the wall. In his haste to leave, Calvin failed to properly secure the kennel latch. The mistake was almost imperceptible, a tiny slip of the metal lock, an oversight born of anger and carelessness. But for Chance, it would become a fleeting sliver of fate. 15 minutes later, when the hallway had fallen into a brief lull, Chance lifted his head, His body trembled violently with each movement, his instincts at war with his terror. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, picking up scents of bleach and damp concrete. Slowly, agonizingly, he nudged the kennel door with his muzzle. The door creaked open an inch. Then another. Chance hesitated, heart pounding so fiercely it seemed to echo in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to remain still and unseen. But somewhere beneath the layers of trauma, the flicker of survival stirred. On trembling legs, Chance slipped through the opening and into the corridor beyond. He did not run. He did not bark. He simply slunk along the baseboards, head low, body pressed tight to the wall, every step a battle between hope and fear. The hallway stretched before him like a gauntlet of terror rows of barking dogs, the metallic clang of kennel doors, the harsh overhead lights that made his eyes sting. Chance moved with agonizing caution, his body language that of an animal expecting pain at every turn, down one hallway, then another, past empty offices and storage rooms, until finally, by pure luck or perhaps some faint memory of safety, he found an old supply closet with the door ajar. Inside, the room was cluttered with cleaning supplies, battered boxes, and a broken chair missing one leg. Chance slipped in and, with the last of his strength, collapsed behind a stack of unused blankets. He tucked himself into the smallest ball he could manage, nose buried under his tail, ears flattened against his skull. And there, in the stale, dusty darkness, Chance made himself invisible. The refuge bustled obliviously around him. No one noticed the empty kennel. No one heard the faint, desperate breathing from behind the closet door. Calvin finished his shift and clocked out without a second thought. The shelter fell into its familiar chaos, cries for food, yelps of loneliness, the low rumble of frustration from overworked staff. But within that forgotten storage closet, a different kind of silence reigned. It was not the peaceful silence of safety, nor the comfortable quiet of rest. It was the suffocating, unbearable silence of a soul who had been hurt too often and too deeply to believe that rescue would ever come. Chance lay there, muscles cramping from tension, too afraid to sleep, too terrified to move. He did not know that, beyond the thin walls, someone would soon begin looking for him. He did not know that the worst of human cruelty, captured on a small black camera, had already set into motion events that would change his life and the lives of so many others forever. For now, he only knew the cold, the fear, and the endless pounding of his own terrified heart. Abby Collins arrived at Boulder County Animal Refuge that afternoon, bundled against the sharp wind that swept across the empty fields. She had only been volunteering for a few months, but already she knew the rhythms of the shelter intimately, the bursts of barking when a new animal arrived, the strained smiles of the staff pushing through another underfunded day, the constant hum of barely concealed desperation. Today, something felt off the moment she stepped through the doors. The usual cacophony was muted, replaced by an uneasy tension that prickled at the back of her neck. Volunteers bustled through their tasks a little faster, their voices pitched slightly higher. A nervous energy rippled through the building like an invisible current. Abby checked in at the front desk, where a frazzled receptionist offered a tight smile. "Chance is missing," she said simply, the weight of the words pressing down harder than any blizzard could. Abby's heart dropped into her stomach. Missing? How? We don't know. His kennel was unlocked when Calvin finished rounds this morning. We're searching now, but he's terrified of people. If he's hiding somewhere, it won't be easy to find him. Without another word, Abby dropped her backpack behind the desk and hurried toward the kennels. She knew Chance, or at least she was trying to. She had spent every spare moment sitting outside his kennel, speaking softly, sometimes simply sitting in silence, allowing him to get used to her presence. Progress had been measured in the smallest of victories, a slight lift of his head, a shift of his trembling body to face her instead of the wall. He would not have run to freedom. Abby knew that instinctively. He would have run to hide. She moved methodically down the corridor, peeking into every open door, scanning every shadowy corner, Her mind raced through the possibilities behind the supply shelves, under the break room tables, maybe even back in the intake storage. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still no sign of him. Panic threatened to take hold, but Abby forced herself to breathe. She thought like a terrified dog, tried to imagine the world through Chance's broken heart. Small spaces, dark spaces, quiet spaces, the forgotten supply closet near the back entrance. Heart hammering, she raced down the hall, bypassing the other volunteers, and reached the battered door. It hung slightly ajar. She hesitated only a moment before easing it open. The smell of dust and old bleach hit her first, then, in the dim sliver of light from the hallway, she saw him. Chance was wedged behind a stack of torn blankets, his body compressed into a ball so tight it seemed impossible that he was still breathing. His eyes, wide and glistening, stared back at her with an expression that made Abby's throat tighten painfully. It was not anger. It was not aggression. It was pure, raw terror. Abby dropped to her knees a good 10 feet from him. Careful to make no sudden movements, she kept her body low, her posture non-threatening, and her voice soft when she finally spoke. "Hey there, sweet boy," she whispered. "It's okay. You're safe." Chance flinched at the sound but did not bolt. Abby took that as a miracle. She did not attempt to approach him. She did not call for backup or try to corner him. She simply sat, letting her presence fill the room in a way that was gentle rather than overwhelming. After a few minutes, she pulled her phone from her pocket, opened her e-reader app, and began to read aloud. Her voice was barely more than a murmur, the words flowing out steadily, weaving a cocoon of calm around them both. She read about oceans and stars, about fields of wildflowers, and the wind across open plains. Chance's breathing remained shallow, but gradually his trembling began to lessen. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes folded into nearly an hour. Abby did not move. At one point, Chance shifted slightly, the smallest of motions a tentative stretch of his paw, a slight relaxation of his taut shoulders. He glanced at Abby, almost by accident, before immediately dropping his gaze again. It was enough to make tears sting her eyes. Outside the closet, the shelter continued its frantic pace. Someone called for a missing file. A phone rang shrilly at the front desk. Dogs barked and howled in the distance. But inside that tiny, cluttered space, a fragile connection was being built thread by delicate thread. When Brian Monroe, the shelter manager, finally found them, he paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before him with wide eyes. Abby looked up, one finger still marking her place in the digital book. She shook her head slightly, a silent plea for patience. Brian's mouth tightened, but he nodded and stepped back, leaving the door open just enough for air to flow through without breaking the fragile peace. As the hours slipped by, Abby remained by Chance's side. She read, and sometimes simply sat quietly, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. It was not much, but it was everything, and though Chance could not yet know it, that act of patience, that refusal to rush or demand or punish, would be the first true step towards saving him not just from the shelter, but from the dark echoes of his past. For now, it was enough that he had stayed, that he had not run again. In the cold, dusty gloom of the supply closet, a silent promise was forged. No matter how long it took, Abby would not give up on him. And for the first time in a long while, Chance's heart, fragile and battered, though it began to beat with something that almost resembled hope. The days that followed Chance's discovery in the supply closet were slow and heavy with cautious hope. Abby continued her quiet visits, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes simply sitting near him as he huddled behind the stack of old blankets. There were small signs of progress, an occasional twitch of an ear when she spoke, a less frantic breathing pattern when she remained still long enough. Yet even as the shelter resumed its hurried rhythm around them, Abby couldn't shake a growing feeling that there was something unusual about Chance, something more than just the visible scars and the silent terror. It started with the way he reacted to certain words. One evening, as she read an article from her veterinary studies about canine body language, Abby said the word search aloud, and Chance's ears flicked toward her instantly. She noticed but said nothing, continuing to read. When she casually said, "Find it," Using the same tone handlers often used during search and rescue training, Chance lifted his head a fraction, an involuntary, almost conditioned response. Abby's heart hammered in her chest. It could have been coincidence, but the look in Chance's eyes told a different story. It was not curiosity, it was recognition buried deep, fighting through layers of fear and trauma. The next day, determined to learn more, Abby stayed after her shift and waited for a rare quiet moment to approach Brian Monroe, the shelter manager. Brian was a man who had spent over 20 years in animal welfare, his face weathered by disappointment and tempered hope. "I think there's something about Chance," Abby said carefully, holding his gaze. "Something different." Brian raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Different how?" "He's a terrified stray with no chip and no ID. Happens all the time, I know, but it's the way he reacts to certain words," Abby insisted. "Commands. Like he's heard them before trained commands." Brian leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You think he's a trained dog. I don't know," Abby admitted. "But there's something, and there's a scar on his right front leg, just above the paw. It's clean, surgical, not from abuse. Like an old injury that was treated professionally." Brian frowned. He swiveled his chair around and pulled up the regional missing dog database on his computer. "Let's take a look," he said. Together, they scrolled through dozens of listings: missing pets, runaway strays, family dogs lost in storms. Abby felt the weight of the task pressing down with each passing name and photo. So many lost, so many never found. And then Brian paused, his fingers hovering above the mouse. "Here," he said. Abby leaned in. The listing showed a stocky PitBull mix with a broad chest, intelligent eyes, and a small white patch on his chest, shaped almost like a lightning bolt. His name was Titan. The description sent chills down Abby's spine. Urban Search and Rescue 9. Last seen 3 months ago, during a landslide response drill outside Fort Collins. Missing during chaos. Presumed lost or deceased. The photo was clearer than most. Titan sitting proudly beside his handler, a young man in a Navy uniform with a wide grin on his face. The pit bull's right leg, she noticed immediately, bore a faint line of scar tissue, just like Chance. Brian let out a low whistle. "If that's him," Abby didn't hesitate. "We have to check." They moved carefully. Brian fetched a handheld microchip scanner, and together they returned to the supply closet, where Chance still lay, curled among the blankets. Abby approached first, speaking softly to reassure him. Brian waited by the door, giving her time to ease his presence into the room without overwhelming the traumatized dog. Chance lifted his head slightly as Abby knelt nearby, his eyes wary but less wild than before. He watched her movements intently, muscles tense, but not retreating further, gently, with deliberate slowness. Abby reached out and let the scanner pass over Chance's body. Once, twice, 3 times, nothing. No beep, no confirmation. Brian frowned deeply. No chip. Could have been missed at intake, but unlikely. Abby swallowed hard, or removed. The idea hung heavy between them. Removing a microchip was not only illegal, it was deliberate, calculated. Someone had wanted to erase Titan's identity. Brian's voice was grim. "If this is Titan, it wasn't an accident he ended up here." Abby sat back on her heels, staring at the dog before her with new understanding. A highly trained search and rescue dog, a hero lost during a chaotic disaster, and now a broken, trembling soul, abandoned in a forgotten corner of a failing shelter. How had no one recognized him before? Because without his handler, without his uniform and purpose, Titan was just another pit bull mix, to most eyes. Just another statistic in an overwhelmed system. But not to Abby. Not anymore. She saw the strength buried under the fear, the trained responses struggling against the trauma, the heart of a warrior still beating beneath all the pain. "You're not just Chance," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "You're Titan. You're a hero." Chance didn't understand her words. but something in her tone made him shift slightly closer, his nose twitching at the salt in her tears. Brian exhaled heavily. We need to make some calls if he's who we think he is. This is bigger than just a rescue story. Abby nodded, feeling a mixture of awe and anger swirling inside her. Awe at the resilience of the dog before her, and anger at whoever had tried to erase him. Somewhere out there, someone was missing their partner. Somewhere, a bond forged through trust, training, and danger had been shattered without warning, and now, by some miracle, or perhaps by the stubborn endurance of a heart that refused to give up, Titan had found his way back into the world. He just needed someone to help him find the rest of the way home. Logan Pierce drove faster than he had in his entire life. The moment the call had come through from Boulder County Animal Refuge, he had dropped everything. His hands had trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, white-knuckled and breathless. The road blurred past him, but his mind was even more chaotic, flooded with images he had tried and failed to forget. 3 months? That was how long Titan had been missing. 3 endless months since the training exercise gone wrong, the landslide that buried equipment, confused the handlers, and sent Titan bolting into the chaos. They had searched for days, Logan leading teams through thick brush, ravines, and broken ground. At first, there was hope. Then came the slow, unbearable march toward acceptance, or at least that was what he had been told to feel. Move on, they said. Focus on the living. But Logan had never accepted Titan's loss. Not really. And now, after all the sleepless nights, the guilt that gnawed at his bones, a phone call had cracked open the impossible. We think we found him. The shelter loomed into view, its battered facade trembling under the weight of the afternoon wind. Logan slammed the truck into park and sprinted toward the entrance, his heart hammering so loudly he barely heard the receptionist's startled greeting. Abby Collins met him at the hallway entrance, her face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. This way, she said, voice low but urgent. He followed without question, boots thudding heavily against the cracked tile floors. When they reached the makeshift recovery room, where Chance Titan had been relocated, Abby paused with her hand on the door. I need you to be calm, she said gently. He's been through a lot. He's not the same dog you remember. Not yet, Logan nodded, though the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. Abby pushed the door open slowly. Titan lay on a thick blanket near the far wall, his body curled protectively, muscles tense even in rest, his head lifted at the sound of the door. His eyes, those deep, knowing eyes Logan had never forgotten, met his own. For a long moment, the room held its breath. Then Titan moved. It was not a leap, not at first. His body twitched with uncertainty, his paws shifting against the ground as if he was fighting some invisible restraint. But recognition, raw and staggering, broke through the fear. With a broken, desperate whine, Titan surged forward. Logan dropped to his knees just in time to catch the 60-pound mass of trembling fur and muscle that launched into his arms. Titan buried his head against Logan's chest, his body racked with shuddering sobs that seemed to come from the very core of him. Logan held on tightly, wrapping both arms around the PitBull and burying his face into the familiar scarred fur. It's okay, buddy, Logan choked out, his voice cracking. I'm here. I'm here, Titan whimpered, his paws scrabbling at Logan's sides, as if afraid this reunion was a dream that might disappear at any second. Tears streamed down Logan's face, unchecked, falling into Titan's fur. Neither of them cared about appearances, about decorum, about the cold tile floor pressing against Logan's knees. All that mattered was that somehow, against every odd, they had found their way back to each other. Behind them, Abby quietly wiped her eyes and stepped out of the room, giving them space that only the broken and the healed could understand. Later, after Titan had exhausted himself and finally rested his head on Logan's lap, the shelter's veterinarian, Dr. Carla Nguyen, entered with a clipboard and a solemn expression. The preliminary examination results were worse than Logan had dared imagine. Titan was severely underweight, having lost nearly 20 pounds. His muscles showed signs of atrophy from prolonged confinement. There were small abrasions on his paws consistent with rough surfaces, and his teeth bore evidence of chewing at metal or wood, likely desperate attempts to escape. More chillingly, there were faint scars along his shoulder where a microchip would have once been surgical, precise. Someone had deliberately removed Titan's identity. As Logan listened to Dr. Nguyen's findings, a deep, cold rage settled into his bones. Whoever had taken Titan had not only stolen his body, they had tried to erase his very existence, and Logan had almost let them succeed. That guilt was the heaviest weight of all. He remembered the meetings after the landslide, the pressure from higher-ups to accept the loss and focus resources elsewhere. He remembered the sick twist in his gut when he signed the final report, officially declaring Titan presumed dead. He had abandoned his partner. He had let paperwork and politics silence the voice in his heart that screamed Titan was out there, waiting for him. As Titan slept fitfully against him, Logan swore under his breath, never again. He would not fail him twice. For all the moments they had shared climbing rubble-strewn landscapes, tracking missing hikers through blinding snowstorms, standing side by side against disasters, Titan had never once hesitated, never once questioned. Logan owed him the same loyalty now. Somewhere, somehow, the people who had done this would answer for it. But first, Titan needed time, patience, and love. He needed to be reminded that he was more than a number on a report, more than a forgotten casualty. He was Titan, and he was finally home. The reunion between Logan and Titan was only the beginning. As the first waves of emotion subsided, reality settled in. There were questions that demanded answers, questions about how a decorated search and rescue dog had ended up terrified and broken in a back room of a struggling animal shelter. Brian Monroe, with Abby's help, pulled the security footage from the day Chance had been brought in. They combed through every second, frame by frame, looking for anything out of the ordinary, and they found it. 2 nights before Chance was officially logged as a stray, the shelter's security camera captured a scene that chilled everyone who watched it. Calvin Ross, the impatient caretaker, appeared in the footage, but he was not alone. Under cover of night, Calvin had unlocked the rear entrance, admitting another man, his face shadowed under a ball cap. Together, they unloaded a large, sedated dog from the back of a battered white van. Chance, Titan. They staged the intake to look legitimate, logging fake paperwork that labeled him as a found stray with no known history. Abby's heart pounded as she watched the footage. Calvin had not merely been negligent, he had been part of something much worse. Brian called the authorities immediately. The investigation that followed quickly expanded beyond the boundaries of Boulder County. With Logan's insistence and Titan's very existence as proof, the FBI was brought in. They began digging into Calvin's background and discovered troubling connections, frequent calls to disposable phones, cash payments, and a history of short-term jobs at various animal shelters across 3 counties. The name that surfaced repeatedly in the investigation was Trent Dawson. Trent had once been a respected member of the state's urban search and rescue team, but a series of misconduct incidents had ended his career in disgrace. No longer able to profit from legitimate work with service animals, Trent had turned his expertise into something darker, an underground network that trafficked highly trained dogs. But these animals were not being sold to loving homes. They were being used to support illegal drug manufacturing operations. Titan had been targeted not because he was just another lost dog, but because of his exceptional scent detection abilities. The working theory was chilling. Trent's organization was training dogs like Titan to detect competitors' narcotics, ensuring the protection of their own illicit enterprises. Others were used to train unregistered security dogs for black market operations. They had stolen not just dogs, they had stolen trust, loyalty, and innocence. The realization struck Logan like a physical blow. He could still remember Titan's first successful rescue, the way the PitBull had scrambled through debris, ignoring danger to pull a child free from a collapsed building. To think that same dog had been reduced to a tool for criminals was almost too much to bear. The FBI worked swiftly. They conducted controlled tests with Titan, carefully observing his reactions to various chemical compounds. Despite the trauma he had endured, Titan's instincts remained sharp. When exposed to traces of specific narcotics, he alerted with the same precision that had once made him a hero. It was those reactions, combined with forensic evidence gathered from Titan's fur and paws, microscopic traces of chemical solvents and soil unique to certain regions, that led investigators to a series of isolated warehouses scattered throughout the foothills. Raids were planned with meticulous care. Logan insisted on being part of the operations, not as an officer, but as Titan's handler once again. The sight of Titan, now wearing a soft harness emblazoned with Federal Investigation Assistant, stirred emotions in everyone who saw him. He moved with cautious confidence, always glancing back at Logan for reassurance, but growing bolder with every mission. In the weeks that followed, Titan's bravery helped uncover not just drugs, but evidence of systemic animal abuse. Several other dogs, many of them with backgrounds similar to Titan's, were rescued from horrific conditions, kept in small cages, starved, and subjected to brutal training intended to recondition them for criminal use. Each discovery fueled the investigators' resolve. The case against Trent Dawson and his associates grew with every raid, every rescued animal, every piece of undeniable proof. Public outrage swelled as news spread. Local and national media picked up Titan's story, the hero dog stolen and broken, who fought his way back to expose a hidden web of cruelty and greed. Titan's transformation from a cowering figure in a dusty supply closet to a symbol of resilience ignited a fire across the community. People who had once turned a blind eye to shelter conditions now demanded change. Legislation was introduced at the state level to increase oversight of animal shelters, implement stricter background checks for employees, and create a specialized task force dedicated to investigating animal trafficking tied to organized crime. Through it all, Titan remained at Logan's side, his spirit healing a little more with every step they took together. The betrayal he had suffered would never be fully erased. The scars, both physical and emotional, would remain, but so too would his courage. Titan was no longer just a dog who had been wronged. He was the catalyst for justice, and his journey was far from over. The weeks following the conclusion of the investigation were filled with difficult choices, but for Logan Pierce, the decision that mattered most came easily. He resigned from the rescue force. No ceremony, no farewell speeches. He simply handed in his badge, packed up his few belongings, and walked out with Titan at his side. There were places he could no longer go, duties he could no longer perform. The work he once loved had asked him to abandon Titan once before, and he vowed he would never again put loyalty second to bureaucracy. Instead, Logan and Abby Collins turned their grief, their anger, and their hope into something new. Together, they founded the Silent Heartbeat Center, located on a stretch of donated farmland just outside Boulder County. The center was unlike any facility the region had ever seen. It was a sanctuary designed specifically for animals like Titan, those whose trust had been shattered, whose bodies bore the marks of cruelty, whose spirits had been bent, but not broken. The center's mission was simple but powerful: to heal, and Titan was its beating heart. With gentle persistence, Titan took on a new role, one that seemed almost destined for him. He became the center's primary therapy dog, working with new arrivals to show them that recovery was possible. Dogs who would once shrink at the sound of footsteps learned, through Titan's quiet example, that not all touches hurt. Puppies, born into fear, learned from Titan's patient posture that the world could be safe. Even humans who had once been careless or ignorant in their treatment of animals found redemption in the lessons taught by a PitBull who had every reason to hate, but chose instead to love. Titan's methods were subtle but profound. He would approach a trembling dog not by force, but by lying down nearby, offering soft glances, slow blinks, and respectful space. Over days, sometimes weeks, the broken animals would begin to mirror him, relaxing their tense muscles, lifting cautious noses to sniff the air, inching closer with tentative trust. It was not quick work, it was not flashy, but it was real, and for every small victory, a tail wag. A first tentative step forward. There was celebration. Logan and Abby oversaw the center's growth, building partnerships with veterinary colleges, animal control agencies, and local shelters. They offered rehabilitation programs for abused dogs, workshops on trauma-informed animal care, and specialized training courses to prepare therapy animals for work in hospitals, schools, and counseling centers. Titan was there through it all, his presence a living testament to resilience. When the trial of Trent Dawson and Calvin Ross finally arrived, Titan stood once again at Logan's side, not as a broken victim, but as a survivor and an advocate. The courtroom was tense, packed with reporters and community members who had followed Titan's story from the first shaky headlines to the sweeping reforms that now bore his name. As Logan testified about the night Titan disappeared, about the weeks of searching, about the betrayal uncovered and the silent suffering endured, Titan lay calmly at his feet, his eyes alert but peaceful. He needed no words to make his statement. His very existence was the testimony. When the prosecution played the security footage, the images of Calvin striking Titan, the clandestine delivery captured on grainy cameras, the courtroom grew so quiet that even the creak of the wooden benches sounded deafening. People wept. Some turned away, unable to watch, but Titan remained steady, a silent witness not just to the pain he had suffered, but to the hope he now embodied. The verdict was swift and unanimous. Both Trent and Calvin were found guilty on multiple charges, including animal cruelty, conspiracy, and involvement in illegal animal trafficking linked to drug operations. Justice, long overdue, had finally been served. Yet for Titan, and for those who loved him, the real victory was not in the sentencing. It was in the lives being healed, the new beginnings being forged every day at the Silent Heartbeat Center. Years passed, and the center flourished. Dogs once deemed too damaged to save found homes with veterans, with families rebuilding from trauma, with children learning to trust the world again. Each success was a thread in the tapestry. Titan had helped weave a legacy of healing born from unimaginable hurt. Titan aged, as all heroes do. His muzzle grew frosted with white, his once powerful stride softened by time, yet his spirit remained fierce and bright. Even when his body slowed, he continued to teach, to comfort, to show by example that wounds could heal, that hope could be reborn. One spring afternoon, as the Colorado wildflowers painted the hills in bursts of color, Logan sat beside Titan in the center's main courtyard, watching a new batch of rescued dogs explore the sun-dappled grass for the first time. Abby joined them, dropping a gentle hand onto Titan's broad back. "Look at what he started," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Logan smiled, blinking against the sudden sting of tears. "He saved us all," he replied. Titan lifted his head at the sound of their voices, his tail thumping once, twice, against the warm earth. He did not need grand gestures or titles to mark his place in the world. He had already written his story in the language of quiet bravery, of steadfast love, of a heart that had never truly been silenced. The Silent Heartbeat Center stood as proof, and every life touched by Titan carried forward a piece of that heartbeat, steady, strong, and endlessly enduring. Long after the news cameras faded, long after the trials were forgotten, the lessons would remain, that even in the deepest darkness, healing was possible, that the smallest acts of kindness could build bridges across shattered trust, and that sometimes the ones who have suffered the most become the brightest beacons of hope for the ones still finding their way home. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to be part of our growing family here at Vale Marks by leaving a comment, subscribing, and sharing this video. Reaching 1,000 subscribers would be more than just a number. It would be a deep source of encouragement for me to continue creating meaningful, high-quality stories that remind us of the goodness still left in this world. Remember the old saying, the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable. Let us be the generation that listens, that cares, that heals. Watch until the very end to carry the full spirit of Titan's journey with you, and perhaps find a spark of hope for your own.